Well, good evening. I'm Brian Skerry, or as Oprah likes to call me, the wet one. You know, I love photography and always have, but I think my passion for photography is a passion for animals and wildlife, and particularly in the ocean. There's just a host of problems and threats facing our world's oceans today. And I've had the privilege of being a National Geographic photographer for the magazine for over 10 years now. And I guess in the beginning, when I began, I started to just want to make beautiful pictures and tell celebratory stories, if you will. But in more recent times, I've sort of shifted my focus to stories about these problems, stories that I hope to bring readers that bring and raise awareness to some of these issues. I think photography has a history of showing that it can change the world. We hope, I suppose, as photographers, to be able to do stories that make a difference. As we all know, there's an incredible amount of beauty in the world's oceans, but the business of underwater photography, on the other hand, is anything but pretty. This is me, of course, prepping one of my underwater cameras before a dive. I can always count on my assistant to be there with his camera and capture that decisive moment, making me look good. But, you know, of course, if you actually get underwater, things improve dramatically. The oceans are spectacular. There's many beautiful things to see. And I've found over the years, I've often been asked by people, you know, what it's like to be an underwater photographer. And I often tell them that, you know, it's not that different than being a terrestrial wildlife photographer. You know, we have to spend weeks and months sometimes waiting for the weather, waiting for animals to show up and for things to just be right. And the only difference is, instead of being cramped up in some blind in a desert or jungle somewhere, I'm usually on some cold, wet, stinky boat in some godforsaken part of the world. Well, it's not always stinky, I guess. Anyway, the business of making pictures underwater is kind of a unique pursuit within the world of wildlife photography. First of all, it requires a great deal of equipment. It's very equipment intensive. We have to have life support equipment like scuba gear, and we put our cameras in housings and have these lights and strobes and so forth. We have to get very close to our subjects. We don't have the luxury of using telephoto lenses. We have to get close to those whales or sharks, which I think is a testimony to the animals themselves. But I'll never complain with all the problems, the things that we have to contend with, because once you get under the water, it's just an incredible world. I've had the privilege of swimming with giant animals like a whale shark, to tiny animals like this tiny little shrimp living in a sea anemone, this guy about half the size of a grain of rice. So from one extreme to the other, but each equally amazing. I've often remarked that I sometimes think of my career as just one string of extraordinary encounters with animals after another. I've swam with giant stingrays in underwater canyons in New Zealand and spent the wee hours of the morning at night in the Sea of Cortez with giant Humboldt squid like this one, a real sea monster if ever there was one, expelling ink here in the Sea of Cortez one night. And I've spent countless hours on coral reefs just looking at 1 square foot or 1 square meter of territory, watching this micro world of little fish down there, this one stopping long enough just to smile for the camera, I guess. No matter how long I've been in the field, it seems like whenever I'm home and feel like I need a rest for a period of time, I find myself pacing the floors and chomping at the bit to get back out on the ocean, because I know that if I spend time out there, I'll see extraordinary things. But throughout the 30 years that I've been doing this, I've also seen some terrible things as well, which is, as I mentioned, one of the reasons I've sort of shifted my focus to begin doing some of these more environmental stories. The question, of course, is how do you tell the story? And this is what I wrestle with as to how exactly journalistically you want to approach some of these subjects. One of the first big natural history stories that I did for National Geographic was a story about harp seals, these beautiful little animals that live up in the Gulf of St. Lawrence in Canada. And initially, when I proposed the story, I just wanted to do a story about the few weeks a year that they come to this place, live on this transient pack ice, and sort of tell a life cycle story. I wanted to show the pups, like this one, making its very first solo swim beneath the ice shelf, and the mother proudly watching. And, you know, the evolution that happens to these animals, getting fat over the few weeks, or a few days, actually, that before they're weaned and ready to go into the ocean. And as an underwater photographer, to show that contrast between surface and underwater as well. But as I began to research the story and get more involved in it, I realized that there were environmental issues that I couldn't deny, couldn't ignore. For example, the seal hunt was continuing to go on. I don't know that many Americans are aware of this, but it's still the biggest mass slaughter of marine mammals on the planet, where they club these baby seals at just maybe 2 weeks old or so, and for the pelts, not for the meat. But perhaps the bigger environmental threat that I recognized was global warming, which I didn't really know going into this story, but it turns out that global warming is having a dramatic impact on these animals. This is a picture I made from a helicopter that shows the Gulf of St. Lawrence in wintertime, and even though there's a lot of ice here, traditionally this would be frozen solid. In years past, it would have been solid block ice, and as you can see, there's a lot of open water. And what that creates is a problem for the seals, where the seals need 12 days to become fully weaned before they can go off on their own. But this is a picture showing a pup at maybe 5 or 7 days old, still has the umbilical cord on its belly there, and the mother frantically pushing it back up to breathe here. This animal had fallen into the water because the ice was so thin. It broke up due to this climactic change that's occurring. So, you know, that particular animal survived and crawled out and made it, but many do not. In the last couple of years, there's been an extraordinarily high mortality rate for these harp seal pups. So I think it was a story like this that kind of opened my eyes to the power of photography from an environmental standpoint, and what it could do to tell stories and raise awareness. On the heels of that story, shortly after, within a year or so, I proposed a story about the global fish crisis. I've been diving for about 30 years, and I've personally witnessed the decline of fish. I see less fish in the places I used to see fish on reefs, and less sharks in the places I used to see sharks. But it was a few years ago I read a scientific paper in the British journal Nature that declared that 90% of the big fish in the ocean have disappeared in the last 50 years. These are the tunas, the billfish, and the sharks. And I was just devastated. I thought that, you know, with a statistic like that, 90% of the fish in the ocean gone, it would be on every news outlet in the world. But it really wasn't. So I proposed the idea of doing this story, and I actually worked with a colleague of mine, Randy Olson, a brilliant social documentary photographer, and tried to tackle this big story of the global fisheries issues. And when I proposed the story, I wanted it to be a really hard-hitting story. I didn't want it to be a pretty picture story necessarily. I wanted it to really tackle these issues and show readers a lot of things about the whole commercial fishing world that maybe they didn't know. But the first component of the story I thought that was important was to show fish as wildlife, and to get some appreciation from readers, consumers, if you will, as to what it is they're eating. You know, I think when we go to a restaurant and, of course, order a hamburger, you know that it comes from a cow, or you order a piece of chicken and you know what a chicken is. But when you order a yellowfin tuna steak and you see a square piece of meat in your plate next to some vegetables, do you really know the magnificence of that animal that you're eating? I think most people don't. So I wanted to go in and make pictures of yellowfin tuna like this, or bluefin tuna. You know, when we eat sushi, this is the most highly regarded type of sushi, is bluefin tuna, but yet these animals have been decimated. Their stocks have declined in excess of 90% in the Atlantic and Mediterranean. They're almost on the verge of extinction, and yet we continue to eat sushi, not realizing that this is an animal that has no terrestrial counterpart. There's nothing like this on the planet. This is an animal, the bluefin tuna, that continues to grow its entire life. If we weren't so good at catching them, there'd be 30-year-old bluefin out there weighing over a ton. They crisscross entire oceans during the course of a year. They have the ability to swim from the equator to the poles because they can generate heat. They're faster than a torpedo underwater. We would never allow the slaughter of that on land, but because it's underwater, it's allowed. I wanted to show things like the mako shark, which you can go into a lot of seafood restaurants and order a mako steak, which is wonderful to eat, but again, we're wiping these animals out. And also with this story, I wanted to do it in a way that drew a contrast, to show the animal in its realm as it should be seen, this magnificent creature, the lions and tigers of the sea, if you will, and then to show it on the beach, you know, being finned here. This was about a 600-pound female mako that was caught, and they're going for the fins first because those fetch the highest price. I also wanted to show with this story the method in which seafood is harvested. I think, again, most people just sort of group seafood in with all other forms of agriculture, and we think it's just another food. But the truth is, it's wildlife. It's the biggest mass harvest or slaughter of wildlife on the planet. And I wanted to show things like a longline. This is an illegal longline, actually, that was in the Sea of Cortez, Mexico, that was catching dorado, like this fish, catching 700 tons of dorado a day, illegally, that ended up in restaurants in Mexico and the United States. I wanted people to know what a longline looked like. I wanted them to see the most common method of fishing in the world, which is a bottom trawl, or a dragger, as it's called. Nets like this scour the planet. This was a small one that I photographed, but you can see the method. Basically, it's a big net that has buoys on top of it and a lead line on the bottom to keep it down. The buoy keeps the mouth open. And these two big steel doors are towed by a boat through the water, and they meet resistance with the ocean and therefore help to open that maw, that giant net. And as it scrapes along the bottom, this was catching shrimp. As it scrapes along the bottom to catch a few shrimp, it's catching everything else in its path and also destroying the benthic habitat, the bottom. It's scraping up all this valuable habitat for other animals. This is a picture I made in that same situation where the fisherman had towed his nets for 1 hour. And after 1 hour, he had a handful of shrimp, maybe 7 or 8 shrimp, and all those other fish, all those other animals died in the process, none of which would be used. They'd all be thrown back into the sea as bycatch or trash. So this is the true cost of a shrimp dinner. About 7 or 8 shrimp and maybe 20 pounds of other fish that'll be killed. And as an underwater photographer, I wanted to go below the boat and show that cascade of death raining down. All these beautiful animals that were alive on the bottom just an hour before had been killed to satisfy our desire for shrimp. So those are the things that I thought this story might be able to do. And to look at gill nets also, a very common method of fishing around the world. In this case, I focused on the shark fishing industry. 100 million sharks are killed on our planet every single year. That's an unsustainable rate. These are the apex predators in the sea, and you can't remove that without the house of cards coming down. And this picture, I thought, ended up being the lead picture in the story because it almost looked like a crucifixion. It had this personality to it, and maybe spoke to the notion of 100 million sharks being killed around the planet. Another story that appeared in the magazine last year was a story we did called An Eden for Sharks. I love sharks. I love swimming with sharks, and I wanted to do a story about sharks. And it occurred to me that to maybe get at the environmental angle, the conservation angle, we should look at a place in the world where sharks are still doing well, because there are very few such places left on Earth. So I went to the Bahamas, a place that I had done a lot of diving, and it seemed to me that this was one of the few places in the world where sharks were still doing pretty well. Largely, that was because of two things, really. It was because of the geography. The Bahamas, this is an aerial picture that I made showing kind of a typical stretch of real estate in the Bahamas where you've got, shallow sandy beaches, and you've got mangrove nurseries and coral reefs, and in the deep blue water, the pelagic zone for different species. So the geography lends itself to great shark habitat. But the other reason the sharks are doing well here is because the Bahamas, the government, has outlawed longlining. They don't allow longlining, which is the most common method for killing sharks around the planet. So although it's not perfect, they seem to be doing a little bit better here. And for this story, I wanted to highlight a few of the key species, some of the species that really hadn't been photographed much before, certainly not for the Geographic. A friend of mine who runs a dive business out of Florida had identified a few new locations in the last few years where we could get close to animals like a tiger shark. I mean, for 20 years, I tried to get close to tiger sharks and never really could. But we found this place, or he found this place, that he calls Tiger Beach. And this is a picture I made with a National Geographic blimp looking down at our dive boat, and you can see about a dozen or 14 big tiger sharks swimming over this sandy bottom in about 20 feet of water. Just a very warm, tropical, sandy location, just brilliant. And once you got underwater, the sand and turtle grass was a great backdrop with this deep Bahamian blue water. And the sharks were extremely friendly. I mean, they would come right up to you. I kept reminding myself that, this was real because, as I said, I spent so many years trying to get close to tiger sharks with no success. And on any given day, I'd have a dozen of them around me. Some days, it got so crazy. I was using a macro lens. I was using a 60mm macro lens to make pictures of the teeth and the little nerve endings of the ampullae of Lorenzini on the shark's snout. I mean, sometimes they got a little too close, but that was just curiosity, I'm sure. But the truth is, for this story, I really resisted the urge and the temptation to make sharks look dangerous. I think there is a temptation for photographers to go down that route because it's not hard. It's not hard to portray sharks in a threatening fashion, but I wanted them to just be something beautiful, just something that was part of an ecosystem that they happen to inhabit. And this series actually kind of exemplified that for me. There was one day where I saw this female tiger shark. She was about 12 feet in length, and she was swimming on the bottom and then lifted up off the bottom, and she had these 3 beautiful little silver fish, these barjacks on her nose. So I sort of left the bottom in unison, and you know, you never quite know. I mean, they're considered the most dangerous shark in tropical waters, the second most dangerous in the world. So you never know how they're going to behave, but as I sort of got closer and closer, she finally just turned, and I made this picture that just showed, you know, these 3 fish with sort of a shadow, almost a little fish tattoo on her face, if you will, but a more gentle look at a tiger shark, this allegedly very dangerous animal, which is, of course, dangerous, but that's not all that they're cracked up to be. I also wanted to focus on shark nurseries for this story, and I went to the island of Bimini in the northern Bahamas, where I could look at lemon shark pups. Here we see a lemon shark pup in one of these mangrove nurseries on Bimini. I worked with a scientist there named Doc Gruber, who has been studying lemon sharks for about 25 or 30 years there. He has an amazing set of data. And this is Doc in a pair of waders. His torso is out of the water. His lower half is in the water here, holding one of these lemon shark pups. And he's holding it upside down in what's called tonic immobility, where you can turn certain species of sharks upside down and they go to sleep. But the shark's not hurt. But each year in June, for about 2 weeks, they conduct research out there where they put gill nets out to catch the baby sharks at night. They work from about 9 o'clock at night till about 9 o'clock in the morning, and they capture the sharks, and then the PhD students will weigh them and do DNA samples and then put them in this little makeshift pen that they create. And they keep all the sharks in there for about a week or 2 and then release them all at the end. They keep them there because they don't want to recapture the same one. And that was interesting for the story. I wanted to have some of the science in there, but what was more interesting, I think, to me, was to hike up into the mangroves and get out into the wild, you know, to actually see some of the sharks in their natural habitat. So this is a picture of me that my assistant made just laying in these mangroves. It was, you know, god-awful hot, 110 degrees maybe, and mosquitoes, all kinds of bugs. But I just laid there, no scuba gear, just mask, snorkel, and fins in my wetsuit, day after day, trying to let the animals acclimate to me and get used to me. And eventually, you know, they did, and they would come close, and I was able to make this picture that appeared in the magazine of this beautiful little lemon shark pup, maybe only a foot in length, tiny little shark, and maybe only a foot of water, and just in this very different shark habitat than what I think we're used to seeing. And I also wanted to focus on the great hammerhead shark, a species that up until maybe less than 10 years ago, no photos existed of these animals. But we found a location where in wintertime you might be able to get close. And I spent 18 days out there trying to get close to these and only had 2 days where the weather was good enough that allowed me to get in. But here you can see this exotic, almost prehistoric looking head where their nostrils have actually separated out to both sides of their head there to give it stereoscopic sensory perception in the ocean. They're actually more advanced than most other species of sharks. It's difficult to make these animals look graceful with the big kind of dorsal fin and pectorals and that head, but this one evening, just before sunset on our last day, the shark came in and kind of swirled around just before the sun set in this kind of a very pretty setting. The last species I wanted to focus on for this story was the oceanic white-tip shark, which is considered the 4th most dangerous species of shark in the ocean, but unfortunately it's 98% in decline throughout most of its range. Just a very sad story. I went to a place in the Bahamas where we had heard rumors that they were finding these animals. Fishermen were catching tuna and they were having them taken off their lines by what they said were oceanic white-tips. So in 16 days, I only had 1 day where we had this beautiful 9-foot female that came in and stayed around for about 2 hours. Because they're considered a very dangerous species of shark, and because we weren't working on the bottom, we were working up in the water column, I brought along a shark cage, and this is my buddy Wes Pratt, a shark biologist with Mote Marine Lab in Florida, who's in the cage. You can see the biologist is in the cage, the photographer is not, of course. So. And then this last frame here, as the sun began to go down a little bit, of this portrait of this beautiful animal, that could very well go extinct in our lifetime, maybe in the next few years, since there's so few remaining. We took a different approach to tell the story of right whales, which appeared in the October issue of National Geographic magazine. Now, right whales are an interesting story in that about 1 million years ago, there was one species of right whale on the planet. And as oceans kind of got separated and land masses moved around, they became isolated. And essentially today there's two main distinct species. There's the southern right whale, which we see here, and there's the North Atlantic right whale, which we see here, a mom and calf. Both species were hunted to the brink of extinction by early whalers, but the southern right whale has come back much better, and the North Atlantic, which we see here, has not. And the reason that the North Atlantic right whale has not come back is because they are an urban whale. They live along the east coast of the United States and Canada, where they're plagued with all kinds of human activity. These are amazing animals. They're very hard to read from the surface. You know, this is a picture made in the Bay of Fundy in Canada of an adult right whale coming at you, and they have this rough patch of skin roughly where we have hair, on the top of their head, on their chin, and over their eyebrows. They're called callosities, and they get occupied by barnacles and these little parasite crab things called cyamids. Very interesting animal. From the surface, this is often all you see. It looks kind of like a muddy boot just floating on the surface, but there's a great animal underneath. And they have this very distinct V-shaped blow, unlike any other whale. So this is what we look for when we're looking for right whales out at sea. They also feed using a method of feeding called skim feeding. This was taken in Cape Cod Bay, where they actually stick their head out of the water and have these baleen plates. They sift the copepods that they eat and then swallow them. So the Pilgrims, actually, when they came to Massachusetts in 1620, reported seeing sea monsters. And you can see why, because they are very bizarre. But as I mentioned, they're threatened. The North Atlantic right whale, there's only about 350 of them left on the planet. They are the most endangered species of whale on Earth. And part of the reason is because, as I said, they live very close to the coast. This picture was made off the coast of Florida just one evening as a sub-adult stuck his head out of the water. But you can see this coal smokestack in the background. And pollution is a big reason, they think, as to why their reproduction isn't what it should be. They're not having as many calves as the southern right whales. And they get entangled in fishing gear. About 72% of the population has entanglement scars, which we see on this tail. Those white marks are not natural markings. Those are entanglement scars from fishing gear. This one got away, but many of them don't, and they die because of that. And they do die also because they get struck by ships. Ship strikes are the leading cause of death, I believe, for North Atlantic right whales. This is one that was struck off of Canada and towed into Nova Scotia. And all the skin had sort of burned off, and the white body became sunburned. And what they typically do when they tow a right whale in like this, they do a necropsy. It's like a type of autopsy to determine the cause of death. So with this one, they actually have to use like heavy equipment, this big backhoe to tow it up on the beach. And then the scientists from Woods Hole began the process of cutting off the head and flensing it and getting it down to the skeletal remains to see exactly what caused the animal to die. And in this case, they reassembled the skeleton here, the vertebrae, and those pieces on the grass are the transverse processes. There were 8 of them that were supposed to be part of that spinal column there. All of them were snapped off in a very blunt trauma, which clearly was a ship strike. So there's no doubt about what caused this animal to die. It was a collision with a ship. And it was the worst of all cases because this was an adult female that we don't want to lose. Not that we want to lose any, but the females, of course, are the worst. They say that if we can just save 2 right whales a year in the North Atlantic, the population will continue to grow and they'll be okay. But right now, they're on a downward spiral. And to contrast the beleaguered North Atlantic right whale, I wanted to show a population of southern right whales that were doing much better because they live much further away from industrialized civilization like we have here. So I went to a population in New Zealand in the sub-Antarctic that was only discovered about 10 years ago. It was a bit of a speculative trip. We didn't know what we would find. They hadn't really been photographed before. So I went down there for 3 weeks on a sailboat in wintertime, as I said, in the sub-Antarctic, so the weather was tough. But I got in the water and was just amazed at what I saw. There were these beautiful whales that were highly curious and just wanted to come close and see me. I was reluctant to have anybody else get in the water with me initially because I thought these animals might be spooked by me. So I dove alone most of the time. And some days the visibility was not so good, but it still was amazing. I mean, these are 45-foot animals, 70 tons, and they were coming close enough, this one kicking up some sand as it swam over the bottom. And on the days when the visibility was really bad, I would go below and shoot silhouettes. This was courtship, kind of a pre-mating event that these whales do. These are two giant whales doing this courtship ballet, if you will, in this very remote part of the world. And then one day I asked my assistant to join me on the bottom. I wanted to see if the whales would be curious enough to visit us one more time when we had clear water. So we went down to about 70 feet of water wearing our dry suits, very cold water. And sure enough, this city bus just swam up. Unbelievable. I spent about 2 hours that day with this whale. It was one of the most extraordinary experiences, if not the most extraordinary I've had in my career. I mean, this was an animal that chose to be with us. I remember that day, you know, you've got all this equipment on. You've probably got about 80 pounds of gear and this dry suit and a tight neck seal, and you're down in 70 feet of water and you're breathing heavy, and I was swimming over the bottom to try to keep up with the whale at one point, photographing it as I moved, and finally, you know, you just can't keep up anymore. So I knelt down on the bottom to catch my breath and thinking the whale would just keep going, and the whale stopped, turned and came back and just looked at me with that big eye and sort of was waiting for me to catch my breath and go. So it's extraordinary when you can have those kinds of encounters. A different story that appeared in the July issue this year was a story I did on Kingman Reef. It's this amazing coral atoll about 12 or 1,300 miles south of Hawaii. I was working with a team of scientists led by a National Geographic fellow, Enrique Sala, who has been studying some of these pristine coral reefs in the most remote part of the Pacific, out in the Central Pacific, as a way of determining what a truly healthy coral reef should be. Traditionally, scientists determined that a healthy coral reef consisted of a biomass that was mostly reef fish, mostly big schools of fish, and very few predators like sharks, like this. But what Enrique and his team has discovered by looking at some of the truly pristine reefs left on the planet is that a real healthy coral reef has just the opposite. It's got 85% predators like sharks and snapper, these big aggressive predatory fish, and about 15% reef fish. It's a complete reversal of the paradigm of what traditionally was thought of. He has a new scientific paper that was just published on this. So we went there, and I was there to document this environment. Here we see one of those snapper, very ferocious fish. These were far more dangerous and intimidating than the sharks. One of these guys actually bit my ear, took a chunk out of my ear one day when I was trying to make a picture of a little shrimp or something on the reef. But Enrique describes these reefs as a landscape of fear, or perhaps a seascape of fear, where the animals are hiding in the reef, these little fish like this blenny tucked down inside a coral head, or this hawkfish just kind of, you know, peeking out a little bit. Photographically, it was a real challenge because I got there and I sort of knew what I was getting into, but you know, you're still expecting to see lots of fish. You're expecting to see big schools of fish, which just weren't existent. The fish were there, but they were all hiding. They were tucked down in the reef, so it was difficult to photograph them. I began to train myself to see this place in more of a landscape way or fashion as opposed to just the wildlife, because the wildlife was hiding. This is actually a new species of coral that we discovered while we were on this trip. It's undescribed to science. We first found it and referred to it as the flying saucer. It was this massive piece of coral. That's Dr. Sala right up there examining it. This is another picture of him looking at it. It's a very exotic piece, but a new species of coral in this remote part of the world. They estimate that this one coral head is about 500 years old, so it's amazing to still find pristine places like that on the planet. But as I mentioned, this landscape, I described it as a galaxy or a universe of hard corals. There were no soft corals per se, but it was this amazingly healthy hard coral reefs of all different kinds and shapes. I mean, it was just spectacular. This picture shows predation on a coral reef. It shows the only natural predator that a coral reef has, which is the crown of thorns starfish. And even though over the years I've seen ones or twos of these, I've never seen what's described as a front of crown of thorns, which is what we see here. This is an entire front, many of them moving along a coral reef, and everything to the right of the frame is dead. They've already eaten that coral, and they're moving ahead to the green or brown part here, which they will eventually eat. But the truth is that this is okay. This is natural behavior. It's natural predation. It's like lions and wildebeests in Africa, perhaps. It's what's expected, and a healthy coral reef is resilient. It can come back from that. A healthy coral reef has things like parrotfish crunching away at the algae and keeping it clean, not choking the coral, removing that algae. It has little fish, as I described, like this damselfish hiding in the coral, this one hiding in some finger coral. And it, of course, has the predators, the sharks and the snapper. Here we see two different species of sharks, a gray reef shark and a white-tip reef shark here, both patrolling over this very healthy coral reef environment. So there are still jewels like this, and the science that's being done will use places like this as a baseline for conservation elsewhere in the world where we need to know how to protect coral reefs. And I wanted to close this evening with another story that I did on New Zealand's marine reserves. I think that one of the real solutions that we need in the world's oceans, particularly to the problem of overfishing, is to create more marine protected areas. Right now in the world, there's less than 0.1% of the world's oceans that are off limits to commercial fishing. Think about that number for a second. Just think, less than 0.1% of the world's oceans are off limits to commercial fishing. That's almost nothing. If you compare, on land, we have many national parks and places that are off limits to hunting or, destruction. But the oceans, we can get away with it. So we need more places in the ocean where fish are given a break. And New Zealand is actually a very progressive country in that regard. They're trying to protect 10% of their EEZ, their exclusive economic zone, by the year 2010, in 2 years. And the reason that this all began was in the early 1970s with this gentleman right here, Dr. Bill Ballantyne, who's the father of marine protected areas, certainly in New Zealand. He's a mollusk scientist. He's not a diver. And even in his late 60s, he still goes down to the beach every day to do his transects and study his mollusks. But in the early 1970s, he picked a place that was just an ordinary part of the New Zealand coastline. It was a place called Goat Island. It wasn't really an island, just little rocks off the coast. But he argued that we needed to protect that. And he had to fight sport fishermen, he had to fight commercial fishermen, and he had to fight scientists, because scientists from the University of Auckland were doing a lot of collecting out there. But ultimately, he prevailed, and they protected this place about 30 years ago. And what Bill told me was he hoped that by protecting Goat Island, certain species of fish would come back, species like the New Zealand snapper we see here that was highly overfished. And they did come back. But what he couldn't anticipate, what nobody could anticipate, was that certain other things would happen. For example, in shallow water near Goat Island, like 20 or 30 feet deep, all they ever saw before was sea urchins lining the bottom, just sea urchins everywhere covering the boulders. But what they didn't know was that when the snapper returned, these fish, that snapper predate on sea urchins. They eat sea urchins. So by controlling the sea urchin populations, when the fish came back, kelp forests returned to shallow water. Nobody ever knew that kelp grew in 20 or 25 feet of water. But today, there are these healthy, lush kelp forests in 20 or 30 feet of water because the snapper came back and controlled the urchin population, and this is how it was. This is maybe how the ocean was 100 or 200 years ago, but nobody's around to tell us. So by protecting places in the ocean, we now have a baseline. We know what it's supposed to be. And the thing that I saw when I was there that struck me as much as the underwater was that the people came to this place. I watched kids every day, like these two little boys that were in a tidal pool, just exploring, maybe future biologists, maybe future photographers, but they were just engaged. They wanted to be there. I watched, young girls, these two sisters that drove all the way from Auckland, about an hour and a half drive with their parents, and they rented masks and fins on the beach, which you can do there, and just wanted to see fish. Ballantyne told me a story. He said that in 1970, before they protected Goat Island as a marine reserve, about 3,000 people would come there every year to go fishing off the rocks. They just hook and line and sport fish off the rocks. And after they passed the legislation to make it a marine reserve, all the newspapers in New Zealand had huge headlines that said nothing left to do at Goat Island because you couldn't fish there anymore, nothing left to do. Fast forward 30 years now to where we are today, not 3,000 people a year, 300,000 people a year go to Goat Island. And they go there not to go fishing off the rocks, they go there to see fish, just to stand on the rocks or to swim with them. And I think that's what it's about. I worked in other places in New Zealand as well. There's a picture of me up on a mountaintop. We had to set down our helicopter because the weather was getting bad. But I wanted to make an aerial picture of a place called Fiordland, which is a very Lord of the Rings kind of environment. It's this beautiful mountainous region with fjords and freshwater rivers that are stained with tannin, lead into the ocean and create a permanent layer of fresh water about 25 feet thick sitting on top of the salt water. So when you dive in, it's like diving in an old dirty river, but you go through about 25 feet of this dirty fresh water that's sitting on top of the salt water, and you break into this crystal clear, dark salt water below. It's like Dorothy emerging into Oz, you know, and this is a picture of some of the animals that live there. It's a very fragile habitat. This is an animal called black coral, which actually appears white underwater. It's only black after you break it off and bring it up and polish it. But this beautiful black coral, like a Christmas tree almost, in this emerald green world as you're looking straight up. But if you were looking horizontally, there's no ambient light. It's pretty dark. There's another picture made in Fiordland of some animals called sea pens, which are reminiscent of the old quill pens. But these are like a type of soft coral. This picture was made at about 70 feet, where there's no ambient light. But these animals, like black coral and sea pens, are tricked into thinking that they're in deeper water. They typically live in very deep water, but because it's dark here, they kind of emerge into the shallower water. And as I was setting up to make this picture, a blue cod just kind of swam in. Serendipity is often one of the greatest things in photography. You just get these moments. But everywhere I went in New Zealand, in all these marine reserves, I saw extraordinary things. Playing peekaboo with a little New Zealand fur seal pup one day in fronds of kelp, and tiny little blennies hiding out in invertebrate bottoms here, these strawberry halotherians, as they're called. I went to the North Island, where the water is bluer, to a place called Poor Knights Island, and saw all kinds of interesting relationships. This little trevally jack having some symbiotic relationship, maybe as a cleaner fish, with this New Zealand snapper. I watched every level of the ecosystem looking very healthy, this beautiful nudibranch crawling over some orange encrusting sponge. An octopus emerging from its den just around sunset time, about to go out and forage, about to go out and hunt. A leather jacket, a type of triggerfish, grazing on the bottom, swimming over this beautiful green bottom. And I wanted to close with this picture, which is a picture that I hope to make for this story, a picture that I think represents how the oceans might have looked 100 or 200 years ago. A primal ocean, if you will, a primal ocean of life. I think that, you know, with an increased awareness, we can begin to understand the problems of our oceans. And by taking ownership of our planet and giving it the protection it deserves, scenes like this will not be the exception, but they'll be the rule. Thanks very much.